Okay, so I'm back, and I wrote up a bunch of notes outlining a certain line of thought that I was having in approaching the topic of Saturn and Aquarius. And I recorded a video yesterday that was about an hour long, and I felt like that was enough of a chunk of information to put out in one go. And I realized I kind of left a couple loose ends that I kind of alluded to, and there's also directions that I could continue to push this kind of thing that I'm doing. And I'm just gonna sort of like mention that I alluded to the topic of anarchism in my last video, and that it's an archetypal thing with the planet Saturn. If you look at Saturn as representing the color black and representing a kind of a barrier, and it's often Saturn is used as a kind of, in the conversation of Puer and Senex, right? Of the young boy and the old man, the old wise man or old crone kind of figure of the Puer Senex archetype. And there's also this the general sense of Saturn being about discipline and rules and all this kind of stuff, and that being conservative and belonging to a certain structure of rules can be very Saturnian. But there's also always the other side of that, which is could be a kind of more anarchistic side. And that's typically, though, about how that conversation is approached. Like people like for instance, Adam Ellenboss, who I took my training from when I got my certification to do natal readings. But there's some other direction, like a different way to look at the topic of anarchism in terms of astrology. I was thinking about maybe making a bunch of videos to develop this idea, but I figure I might as well just put it out there as the kind of kernel of what I'm thinking. And one of the things that I've been watching Game of Thrones for the first time, and one of the things about like Game of Thrones is that it's interesting for me because if you think about, let's talk about like Jungian archetypal, like if I'm a young man, if I go to a men's group, there'll probably be guys who talk about, like, getting in touch with your king. You gotta find your king, and you gotta take control of your life and put your house in order. And then there's all this stuff that kind of goes with that side of it. That in some way I can see that there's like a kind of a value to that. That I don't want to put myself against it, and I'm not positioning myself as being complete. And I have actually maybe a certain idea of entertaining the idea of getting more involved with things like Jungian therapy or Jungian men's group. But I have certain personality things, and I don't know how many Jungians might be watching this video. Sometimes there's people that just like to talk a lot on the internet that I probably shouldn't say everything that I I have to want to censor things to be polite, but based on what certain people who run their mouths might say. But then if I join in the party, maybe I'm just as bad. So whatever. but the Jungian, I don't know. I'm not. When you approach it at that level, it's not very helpful, I find, right? And involved in that kind of but like an actual therapeutic I'm not against all those principles and those frameworks, but there's when I'm trying to say the archetype of the king and all this kind of stuff. It's clearly obvious that when we're talking about actual kings and actual queens and actual people, human beings, not in the sense of Platonic idealism, the perfect form of the ideal of what the ideal leader, the ideal king, the ideal person is supposed to represent, is often the actual historical reality of what these people are like may not match that ideal very well. In some of the videos I've been doing I did a reading of this Simone Weil piece called The Impossible. I was basically trying to talk about the gap between the actual and the ideal, and that some of my own personal things going on, which I'm going to leave the details private, but I've sometimes been accused of being a bit of an idealist, of having my principles are too idealistic, and I'm you know the realities grim or grisly, or I don't know. I mean, it's exaggerating, but you know, like there's something about Capricorn Saturn energy in all this, right? That's kind of like the with Pluto too. It's kind of like, it's a bit like the naked lunch thing about like the grim, the reality that you have to face, and you know, your idealism is like, you know, corrupted by it or something, right? Those are some of the archetypal dynamics that I can kind of like pick up on anyways. But what the Game of Thrones thing, I guess I'm heading right into that now. The main idea that I'm kind of teasing at, of direction of possibly continuing in, is that if you look at astrology as being a system where you've got the sun as representing a kind of a central power source, and the moon having its own symbolic, you know, importance as the other luminary, and how where did this all come from, right? It came from in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, imperial life, and you know, looking at the chart of a king or an emperor or a noble person, a noble family, and using what you knew about this person and their standing in society, and using what you knew about the astrological influences to try to get an idea of what to expect from this person's life path and that kind of stuff. And that's kind of where natal chart reading comes out of. So I was pursuing my interest in this. I took a Hellenistic astrology course. I'm primarily interested in you know, looking at ancient source material of like Greek and Roman. I do read some modern astrology stuff as well, of course, but there's something about this though that I kind of realized that it's kind of like going in the leftist direction. It's usually seen as more of a conservative thing to do, to take an interest in the classical stuff. But I read a lot of James Hillman. He's a leftist who talked about the return to Greece, and I would also mention stuff like Jordan Peterson being a Jungian, and I kind of take a Hillman approach rather than a Peterson approach. So I associate myself as being in the Hillman camp. When I'm talking about these sort of the men's group stuff, right, and the getting in touch with your king, that's also kind of like a Robert Bly thing, right? But there's that. When you look at something like Game of Thrones, there's a number of things going on. First of all, it's kind of like the fallen king, the idea that the centralized power source is kind of like under dispute, and apparently this has a historical significance because the situation was inspired by the War of the Roses, which was an actual historical thing that happened. And this is one thing I'm just sort of teasing at, that I could do a lot more research and look at different historical events that have happened over time, because history has always been one of my interests, right? And to understand, but I can, from the little bits that I'm putting together myself, I can sort of see historically how when you went from having what you consider a monarchical society that believes in the king as a kind of centralized power source that has this myth around it of like the divine right of kings and all this kind of stuff, to what, you know, modern times in Nietzsche's kind of like the masters of suspicion. Not really like the idea of, this is the kind of tension that I feel between the kind of the modern life thing and doing this thing of like ancient astrology, which is taking this archaic stuff that comes out of, you know, Roman Greek culture and introducing it into modern life, which is, and there's certain undertones that when you do that have that I would never want to sympathize or identify myself with certain extremist political positions, but there's a certain like fascist sort of thing going on, because if you look at people like Donald Trump, a lot of their let's put it this way: if Donald Trump was in a Game of Thrones family, I would argue that Donald Trump would be a Lannister, and that the Lannisters, to me, represent some kind of Roman imperial influence. And if you look at the way their armor is, and the way they kind of their attitudes and how they present themselves, there's something about Lannister. I mean, there's probably other people who are much more educated about how the actual George R.R. Martin stuff, but you can understand Trump in that kind of dynamic as being a guy who comes from big money, big power, family, and being kind of in having all that. Like and Trump also kind of taps into that king archetype, right? Like and I think in America you have more of a centralized kind of power structure in a way that almost resembles more of that kind of like feudal monarchy. And whereas if you took a look at European politics, oftentimes in European politics you have, instead of having a two-party system, you'll have multi-party parliament, and that governments might just like not last very long, like only last like 6 months before the parliament falls apart. And like I lived in Australia for a year, and Australia is kind of like this. Like there's these political forces that are always kind of like trying to compete for power, but it kind of evens out in this way that they're all kind of useless. And that like this whole thing about like the king as like a centralized power figure, and this, which is kind of interesting, is that if you look at like Putin has been kind of made himself into this figure that is like, it's not even really democratic, because like how are they going to elect Putin out? I don't have to get into the details of Russian politics. You know what I'm trying to say though, right? Like it's on what I'm trying to point to is that there's something I feel about modern politics that kind of resembles a feudal imperialistic system. And one of my influences has always been Philip K. Dick, who said that the empire never ended. And how, like, Philip K. Dick had these visionary experiences where, for him, the difference between being in modern times and being in classical, archaic, biblical, ancient Greece or wherever, it's like he had these like temporal fold things going on where he felt like he was. There are people, I've got friends who, if I talk about this, they'll know what I'm talking about. And if you get into the sort of stuff about a holographic matrix, or that there's stuff, it starts sounding like new age, like jibber jabber if I start throwing out those kind of words though. But the idea that time is, at some level, time is a singularity, and that we're experiencing it all like spread out. And that we're experiencing space and time spread out, but at some level, time is there's some level where the past and the future and everything like that fold into each other, and that Philip K. Dick was having those kinds of experiences. And there's something about it where we're trying to like progress out of whatever into modernity, but there's still a lot of things in the structure of modernity that feels like feudalism, basically. And like I don't know, I was a young guy growing up in the 90s, a millennial kind of guy, and I remember there being a song, Jello Biafra from the Dead Kennedys did this protest group with some Seattle, like some guys from Nirvana and Soundgarden, and they called it the No WTO combo, but they had this song called New Feudalism. I'm just sketching this out because I don't know if I'd be able to throw that into a video if I get copyright problems or something like this, right? But there's something about like pushing so far into the technological future that you realize there's some sort of pattern or structure that you're not. It's like the Philip K. Dick thing. The empire never ended. But it's obviously like Jello Biafra is not quite as mystical as this, right? But for me, there's something about it where the punk rock and the Philip K. Dick mysticism are not, they kind of mix them together. In my mind, they kind of work together. Of course, the thing is that the historical context of the no WTO combo and new feudalism happened right before the world, a couple of years before the World Trade Center 9/11 stuff, and then it was a completely different political situation where it's like to make punk rock music that was that explicitly criticizing world trade or the World Trade Organization when there'd been a massive terrorist attack. It was a lot harder for people to just openly take that kind of a political position, because being that critical of like world trade, capitalist, blah blah, it's like there, and also like, you don't want to make yourself into a religious extremist that is a target for like whatever, like the paranoid CIA people are worried about you starting some sort of thing, right? And I'm just, so obviously that's not what I'm doing here, but I'm kind of just rambling on some of these ideas that I've had of possible directions to take this anyways, and I still have some notes that that I need to go over here. I wonder if I should talk more about the War of the Roses thing. I'll finish that off first. The War of the Roses thing, what I'm trying to say, though, is that if you take this idea of the archetype of the king, centralized power structures, stuff like that, right? And then look at a situation where that started to fall apart and there's a bunch of different parties all kind of vying for position, for power. And you can look at that as just the Game of Thrones story, or if you're more into history, you can look at different historical times where this has happened. And the kind of the point is that people talk about like the archetypal structure, like there's maybe this like aversion to the sense that the king, the like we're locked into a metaphysical structure that it's hard to negotiate with, that's deterministic, basically, that is like, there's an essentialist kind of thing going on that you can't escape, and that your life is predetermined by that, and that I think there's a lot of aversion to astrology because of like the agency panic of being locked into this thing and having no like whatever, like how am I supposed to work with that, right? Like but what I'm trying to say, if you look at something like Game of Thrones or the War of the Roses, is that instead of being a situation where everybody is beholden into some sort of like there's a structure, of course, right? There's obviously a structure. There's obviously kings and the line of command, but the putting one particular person in that position is relative, is what I'm trying to say. It's a relative thing to put anybody in this like king emperor position, and they can only hold it for so long, and their ability to fulfill that position, to fulfill the ideal of what that should be, is always limited by the fact that they're a human being, which is obvious. I shouldn't have to say this, but this is all what we should all already know, right? But the relativism of the human the ability of the human not to be that king, and is kind of like associated with this whole archetype of like the death of the father, the death of God, and a kind of this like we've ended up in kind of what Lord of the Flies situation, where we've kind of got a society of like look, I have to admit, I'm on disability and I'm living with my family and I don't feel like much of an adult. But when I look around, I don't really see an adult society. I see a society of like, fully grown people with the mentality of children watching like Disney movies and kind of nursing themselves into this sort of childhood naive fantasy about like good and evil and it's like it doesn't feel like a very mature society that we live in. And part of I feel like I have my own Puer Senex issues I need to work out, but there's the micro and the macro, which are interconnected. At some level, I think my own Puer Senex stuff is sort of indicative of a Puer Senex thing going on in the broader culture, and I'm here to kind of like participate in that conversation. And, by tying that in with the Puer Senex, I'm not completely just rambling off track with my this Saturn topic that I'm trying to do here. So, like, basically what I have sketched out here, there's like an idea that I wasn't able to finish. And it basically builds off a bunch of stuff that I got from taking this course, Groundwork for a Philosophy of Magic, from J.F. Martel. And I also took the Weird Studies Weirding course with him and Phil Ford and whatever, a bunch of other ones. I guess whatever. Anyways, so I'm applying some ideas I took from J.F. Martel, and I'm applying that to the problem of, I brought up the Weird Sisters in my last video. The three fates, namely one of the fates is called a nonke and has to do with this kind of binding necessity. We are bound by necessity to do certain things in life, and that what we describe as our material life or mundane or realism. What's realistic in life is sort of dictated by necessity, right? That it's necessary to do certain things to make life happen. I don't have to, whatever. So, but the thing is, in the whole emanation model, there's the other principle is the absolute, right? And G.F. Martel has this whole system of making an argument for absolute non-contradiction, and then relativizing everything else, basically. So making a philosophical move where you use this, basically you can consider it a law. Implement the law of absolute non-contradiction, and then everything else of that is relativized. And in the emanationist model, if you look at necessity, it's basically like, what I'm trying to say is like asking the question, what is of an absolute necessity? And that there's a lot of things which are that you maybe should do, or at some level you have to do, or there's some but if you're actually touching upon the absolute, if you use the stuff of like Neti Neti, like not this, not this, you have to do that to get to the absolute. So basically, it relativizes everything that is not absolute to the absolute. And in my so like I'm basically using that principle to take on something that Mark Fisher outlined as capitalist realism, right? Capitalist realism is like there's a certain let's look at our world that we live in. Because we are such a technological society, let's look at our society from the point of view of a computer, and that our computer is maybe our computer has a certain structure, that it has an operating system and it has a processor and has memory and it does all these things, but that we have certain software that runs the computer, and that it's not an absolute necessity that you have to run a certain kind of software to run your computer. You could always switch from one operating system to another, one platform to another, and that while all of these platforms may only have minor differences, and that's kind of the political problem, is that different politicians are trying to run different software, and people get frustrated because they're like what's the point in using this operating system versus that one? They both do the same thing, they both have the same problems, there's nothing fundamentally different about them. And the idea of what I'm trying to do in this is basically just relativize the necessity of programming the operating system a certain way, because I mean, I'm coming at it from a philosophical kind of, I guess you could say it's a metaphysical perspective, because just think that that's how it is anyways. It's not really like, it's not even like making an argument that you should or shouldn't, or this is what it's, but just outlining the actual, like, an argument, trying to make a solution for Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, saying that capitalism is some sort of necessary thing that defines our reality, and then saying, well, you know, the necessary is by definition relativized to the absolute, and that if you take a path of devotion, that to not be tricked into having the relative rule your life, and that your devotion is to the absolute, that is, you know, is making an anti-capitalist spiritual path, basically. I mean, the fact that it doesn't have to be, you have to be that hung up on the anti-capitalist part of it, but that if you start to create sort of points of tension, if the capitalism kind of, if you get dragged down into these relativistic things ruling your life, and that most of, I think that what is a spiritual path is trying to free ourselves from these kinds of influences, basically. Okay, so I think that is a pretty good. I've communicated what I wanted to, so I'll leave it there for now, and that's a nice under half an hour video. Okay, great.